Hello, all. I wanted to set up chapter 2 with just a brief discussion about kind of what the overarching point is of chapter 2 and what we're going to talk about and learn about, and give a little structure to the numerous examples or numerous visuals that we're going to learn about. So, uh, chapter 2, we start digging into ways that we can take this data that we have in front of us, and summarize it. Okay, and like I said, most of what we're trying to do in chapters 2, 3, and 4 is be able to talk about the data that we have in a quick, easier to interpret way, and some of that involves some calculations, which we'll get to more in chapter 3. Calculating the mean and the spread and um, maximums and things like that. But in chapter 2, we're going to talk more about how do we just summarize what's in there in terms of breaking it down by categories or things like that. So as we talked about in chapter 1, one of the things that we'll need to keep track of is what type of variable we're working with. And a data set is liable to have various different types, and so each variable we may have to tackle slightly differently. And the biggest breakdown there, and what'll come into play most here in chapter 2, is whether this is a qualitative or a quantitative variable. So that's going to break us apart into the two different routes we go with a particular variable. So for instance, when we have qualitative variables, we're going to think about putting those into bins, breaking them up based on the classes that are already laid out in front of us, right? So imagine you have data and it's the model of the car, and that's your variable, a particular variable. Well, it's going to be pretty clear how we should break up this data if we want to summarize it, and so we'll just use the classes that are already in the variable for the most part. When we turn to quantitative, we'll do very similar things. This pen is not working, but there we go. At that point, we'll have to kind of make up what we'll call bins, but it'll be very similar. So we will learn first in the first part of chapter 2. We're going to learn about frequency tables. Okay, and that's going to be a way that we count up. Basically, a lot of what we're doing in chapter 2 is counting. Okay, and we'll learn how we can have Excel do that for us. But we're going to learn frequency tables, and tied in with that is going to be relative frequency tables. Okay, and that's just dividing by the total. So it's pretty simple. These two are very much connected, and oftentimes you'll see them, or we'll produce them side by side. But frequency tables, if we want to then display that data, most of the time what we see it as is, let me just change colors quick. What that means is visually, we would build a bar chart. Okay, or alternatively, a pie chart. Okay, and so we'll learn about how to create those. What we'll also learn about, and I'll put up a reading on this to direct you to that later, is what are some good practices when you're actually building something like a pie chart or a bar chart, and how do you decide exactly should I use a bar chart or a pie chart, because they largely can present the same data. So this is with qualitative data. We can go down that route. With quantitative data, again, we will build a way to structure it both kind of in a table and also visually. But when we put it into a table, we're not going to call it a frequency table, although it's very similar. We're going to call it a frequency we're going to call it a frequency distribution. Okay, so my penmanship is lacking, but frequency distribution and frequency tables are very similar, and you should at times be a little confused about which one we're dealing with because they are so similar. And we'll talk about how we build it. And with a frequency distribution, it's just there's an extra step in there. We have to decide on our own what the bins are going to be, and we'll talk more about that and go through some examples. But it's kind of the counterbalance of the qualitative frequency table is the quantitative frequency distribution, and just as with the qualitative variable, there is going to be a relative, really struggling with penmanship, relative frequency distribution. Okay, so there's that mirror of that as well. And again, that calculation is the same as the transition from frequency table to relative frequency table is the same as on the distribution side. Okay, and then when we turn into visualizing that, okay, instead of a bar chart, we're going to do something called a histogram. And it, again, is going to look very similar to a bar chart, and it may take a few times before that sinks in what the difference is. And there's not a lot of difference there, again, based on the fact that we've already made our bins up ahead or up above. There's not a big difference between a bar chart and a histogram, but we do a few things different when we design them and when we structure kind of how they're laid out visually to remind ourselves of what type of variable we're working with. And then lastly, tied in with a histogram, we don't really have a pie chart. You could theoretically build a pie chart for this, but typically not done. But we do sometimes see what is called a frequency polygon. Okay, and we'll talk about that. And then the last little concept in chapter 2 is a little bit different. So all of this material is kind of self-contained, and it's all about displaying the same type of data where we're just counting up what's in our variables. But we will finish out the chapter with this concept of cumulative. That's not how you spell cumulative. Cumulative distributions. Okay, and it fits here in chapter 2 mainly because it follows more from kind of what we just will learn from frequency polygons. But it is kind of set aside. So if you get to that and it feels a little foreign from the rest of the chapter, it is a little bit different. So that's where we're headed, and I'll be back with some videos on the specifics of each of these types of calculations and visualizations.